Greetings, Father Mark signing on, continuing the series on the early modern papacy. We left off last time with the death of Pope Hadrian VI on September 14th, 1523. The conclave of 1523 nearly dissolved over a deadlock that that might have produced another schism over political issues and family dynastic feuds, as well as national hatreds and ethnic hatreds. At the same time that the Protestant movement was spreading and was causing schism over doctrinal and ecclesiological issues. As it happened, the conclave of 1523 lasted for 50 days. It's 50 days. And that's 4 votes a day, they would take. 4 ballots a day, 2 before lunch, well, not necessarily lunch, but 2 in the morning and 2 in the afternoon. Finally resulted in the election of another member of the Medici family. He was a cousin of Pope Leo X. As Pope 219, he took the name Clement VII. He was the illegitimate son of Giuliano de' Medici. Giuliano de' Medici was a son of Cosimo de' Medici and a brother of Lorenzo de' Medici, who's Lorenzo the Magnificent in Renaissance history. 1 month before Giuliano, the future Pope Clement VII, 1 month before he was born, on on Sunday, April 26th, 1478, a conspiracy against the Medici family in Florence, orchestrated by a rival house, the House of Pazzi, Pazzi, successfully assassinated Giulio's father, Giuliano, and grievously wounded his uncle, Lorenzo. So when Giulio was born, he in Florence on May 26th, 1479, his uncle, Lorenzo, had him baptized Giulio, like a dominion, Giuliano was his father, so Giulio. And Lorenzo took responsibility for his upbringing. On March 11th, 1513, as we covered previously, Lorenzo's own son, Giovanni de' Medici, was elected Pope 217, taking the name Leo X. And that's, was in his reign that the Protestant movement began, that Luther nailed up his 95 Theses. So cousin Leo, as Pope, named his cousin Giulio Cardinal Archbishop of Florence in 1513. See, that's part of the feudalism problem is nepotism. In March of 1517, cousin Leo then added the appointment of vice chancellor of the Holy See, which was essentially the treasurer. In that capacity, Cardinal Giulio de' Medici attended the conclave of 1523. He was known by everyone by this point to be supremely well-educated, highly cultivated, with diplomatic experience, visiting all the important royal courts of Europe. He was multilingual. So after 50 days of arguing, he seemed to be a safe compromise candidate. He accepted election on November 19th, 1523, as Pope 219, taking the papal title Clement VII. He reigned for 9 years and 10 months, and a great deal happened in that time. Clement was not as dissipated in his moral vices as had been, say, Alexander VI. Had Clement been Pope a generation earlier, he would have been remembered as a lax, pleasure-loving, easygoing pontiff who did neither much good nor much bad. Unfortunately, he did not live at another time. He lived at this time when history was making a fundamental realignment, and it proved to be beyond his capacity to handle it. In order to appreciate why the Protestant movement was not crushed, as had been previous such political theological movements, such as the Hussites in 14th century Bohemia, present-day Czech Republic, and as had been the Albigensian movement in France in the 13th century, the following context must be kept in mind. First, the most powerful Catholic monarchies in Europe were at war with each other over political and territorial disputes deriving from centuries-old conflicts that went back to the Middle Ages. And, specifically, the problem of dynastic intermarriage. That, royals only wanted to marry other royals, aristocrats only wanted to marry other aristocrats. Resulting in, after centuries of this, that all the royal houses of Europe had claims on everybody else's realms if they chose to exercise them, which they often did, just to steal some other people's stuff, and provoking one war after another. In terms of Pope Clement VII, he inherited a struggle for hegemony over Europe between Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, leader of the Habsburg dynasty, against Francis I, King of France, and leader of the Valois dynasty in French history. That's Valois. So these two dynasties, the Habsburgs and the Valois, were Catholic. And then when Spain got involved, the House of Trastamara, of course, they also were Catholic. And Portugal, the House of Avis, they were all, and then later the House of Braganza, they were all Catholic. And under normal circumstances, or I should say not normal, but like in previous cases with the Hussites and the Albigensians, such Catholic monarchs could be called upon by the Pope in times of crisis, such as that emerging in Germany and Switzerland, triggered by the Protestant movement. But as events developed, in this case, in the 16th century, they would not cooperate with each other. The French and the Germans would not cooperate with each other because of the centuries-old ethnic hatred, but also in general, but in particular because of the ongoing dynastic struggle between the House of Valois and the House of Habsburg. And there will be cases, as we'll see, where one of the Catholic sides, one of the Catholics would actually ally with Protestants against another Catholic, just for the sake of political and military advantage. So these Habsburg-Valois wars caused, as all wars, they caused pointless, needless bloodshed, and dissipated the unity of purpose and effort that might have more effectively dealt with the Protestant movement. Okay, second, which is really a corollary to the first point. The papacy, in such a circumstance, was essentially neutralized in coping with the schism, the Protestant schism, because the papacy, again and again, was forced to choose sides between Catholic France or the Catholic Habsburg realms, which, as long as Charles lived, included not only Austria and the Netherlands, but also Spain and all the Spanish holdings in the New World. Both sides had dynastic claims on territory in Italy. So in other words, both the Habsburgs and the Valois could, and they did, claim had claims on Lombardy, which is northern Italy, centered around Milan, and Naples, Sicily, which is Naples is in the mainland, southern Italy, and in between is the Papal State. So that's both frontiers. So the no pope. I know there's the church is getting involved in politics. Well, yes, it was, but in this context, the no pope could afford to ignore the conflict, because it really mattered. If whoever won, if they would decide to exercise their claim on Lombardy to the north and Naples to the south, and garrison them with troops, then the Papal State, the Holy See, would be sandwiched in between, and then could lose its independence, as had happened before in church history, as we covered in the medieval and then during the Avignon period. Third, the Turks, which was the ascendant power in Islam at that point. They availed themselves of the self-destruction of Europe to invade and conquer the Kingdom of Hungary, as we saw last time, which, it may be remembered, had been, in previous such struggles, like against the Hussites, had been an ally of the Holy See in dealing with such politicized ecclesial conflicts. Okay, with that background, now we'll get back to the chronology. In the year 1524, the Protestant movement spread to Sweden. So we've seen it emerge in Germany in two forms, the Lutheran form and the Anabaptist form, and we've seen it emerge in Switzerland under Zwingli. So now it spreads again to another nation, Sweden, 1524. This is another sad story, that did not have to happen, but it did. Sweden, if you recall from the medieval course, was first brought into the Christian world by St. Ansgar, Ansgar. That's their rendering of the name Oscar. He lived from 801 to 865. He was a Frankish missionary. Understanding, from the 9th century to the 16th century, Sweden was Catholic. Understanding how and why Sweden left the church in 1524 requires some background, beginning with an introduction to one of Martin Luther's early collaborators. So Protestantism in Sweden did have a connection to Luther. The guy we have to meet next is named, his actual name was Philip Schwarzert, but he's better known by his pen name, Philip Melanchthon. Melanchthon. His life dates 1497 to 1560. So he was born, Philip Schwarzert, at Bretten, which at the time was in the one of the electoral states of the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, we said there were 7 electors. Well, one of them was the elector, the Palatinate, the elector Palatine, and Bretten was in that. Now, later, it was in the state of Baden-Württemberg, which is southwest Germany. His father, Philip's father, Georg, was an armorer, a specialized blacksmith, to the Count of Palatine. So, working class in the sense of, but important, financially well off, laborer. In 1507, Philip studied Latin and Greek at the local school. There he was exposed to Aristotle at a very early age, and that was crucial for his later approach to systematizing the doctrines of the Protestant movement. The following year, 1508, Philip's parents died, so he and his brother were sent to his maternal grandmother, Elizabeth Reuter. Her brother, in other words, Philip Melanchthon's great uncle, was a guy named Johann Reuchlin, Reuchlin. He was a Renaissance-style humanist who suggested that Philip change his last name, or at least in his pen name, from Schwarzert to the Greek equivalent. So Schwarzert means dark earth, which is not pejorative. Like the dark earth means fertile soil. The rich dark soil is fertile soil. So so it's not an insult, but it's not euphonic. So the Greek equivalent to that was Melanchthon. So that's where that came from. Philip followed the suggestion, and it's by that name that he's best remembered. Demonstrating from his early youth a proclivity for languages and scholarship, Philip was sent to the University of Heidelberg in Germany, where he studied philosophy, rhetoric, astronomy, and he became known as a scholar of Greek. He had already been exposed to Greek, but he became, went beyond that to be a real scholar, deep learning in Greek. He then continued his study at Tübingen, where he continued. He added law, mathematics, and medicine to his studies. He earned a master's degree from Tübingen in 1516, and then began studying theology. And here is where we find the connection to Luther. Like Luther, Melanchthon developed a deep aversion to the scholastic method of teaching theology, which we already talked about in the section on Luther. And he extrapolated from his dislike the conclusion that authentic evangelical Christianity was actually and actively obstructed by scholasticism, by the scholastic method. And he offered popular lectures once he's a magister. Once he had he was able to teach himself, and he offered popular lectures on pagan writers, ironically, Virgil, Livy, Terence, and he published a grammar book of classical Greek. So he had undeniable intellectual talent, yet his vocal opposition to the scholastic method forfeited any permanent position. Like the university was not going to offer him a professorship, in other words. So he accepted an invitation from Martin Luther to leave the University of Tübingen and go to the University of Wittenberg, where Luther was. There, Melanchthon was appointed professor of Greek at the age of 21. More importantly, for the Protestant movement in Wittenberg, he began studying Scripture under Luther's tutelage. And Melanchthon was physically present at the Leipzig disputation in 1519 between Luther and Johann von Eck, which we covered previously. Now, Melanchthon didn't participate in the debate. He just went as a spectator. But still, and remember what happened there, Luther took public positions at the Leipzig debate which were at variance with church teaching. And Luther at the time was a friar. He was a priest, an Augustinian friar and ordained priest. So, that's going to lead to the problems. And so after that, after the Leipzig disputation, many had to make some life choices, life-altering choices. Luther was one, and we already saw his choice. He chose not to back down. As one of his biographies by what's his name, the Yale guy. He rode his bike to work every day, lived to be 100. What's his name? Anyway, the name of the biography this guy wrote of Luther is called "Here I Stand." Based on a line attributed to Luther. "Here I stand, I can do no other." It's going to bother me now. I'm not going to remember that guy's name. Well, anyway, so Luther, that was his life-altering choice. And so Melanchthon, who agreed with the positions Luther took at Leipzig, also had to make some life-altering choices. And he sided with Luther. Specifically, Luther's articulation of sola scriptura, Scripture alone, as the criteria for evangelical truth, and Luther's articulation of justification by faith alone. And he joined Luther on the negatives, so he embraced Luther's declarations of belief, but then he also shared Luther's condemnation of Catholic devotion to saints. They dismissed that as paganism, rejected transubstantiation in the Eucharist, the real presence in the Eucharist, and classified the papacy as a purely human creation, an administrative development, having no claims to divine protection in matters of teaching. Melanchthon lectured at Wittenberg. Now remember, he's still technically he's a professor of Greek, so he does have standing to lecture there. So he lectures on the Gospel of Matthew and St. Paul's letter to the Romans, which of course were in Greek, and the New Testament was written in Greek. And that the lectures were so well received that the university awarded him a degree in theology and offered him employment, a promotion, so to speak, to teach on the theology faculty. He celebrated, now that he had stable employment, by marrying Catherine. Her name was Catherine. I'll spell her family name to avoid any misunderstandings. Krapp was her family name. I won't pronounce it, but that's how it's spelled. And it was quite the marriage up for Melanchthon. She was the daughter of the mayor of Wittenberg. They married in 1520, had 4 children. Melanchthon's enduring contribution to the Protestant movement was a work he wrote, the Loci Communes in Latin, but it means, the actual translation is common places, but it has nothing to do with geography. The full title was Common Places in Theology, and a subtitle, Fundamental Doctrinal Themes. In other words, it's a summary of Lutheran teaching. It was published in 1521. In it, he delivered a systematic presentation of Lutheran doctrine, structured under the headings, or he called them leading thoughts, all extracted from St. Paul's letter to the Romans. So that became the outline of the first textbook of Lutheran doctrine. One student. So what does all this have to do with Sweden? And there's always, I know maybe I go into too much detail, but it's like this is all connected if you go deep enough. So the connection to Sweden is that while Luther and Melanchthon were at Wittenberg, of course they were teaching. One of their students at Wittenberg, actually two of them, they were brothers, so the two brothers attended together. They were the men who brought the Protestant movement to Sweden. And they brought the Lutheran version of the Protestant movement to Sweden, which led it out of the church. And so this was Olof, O-L-O-F, Pearson, P-E-R-S-S-O-N. Now he also Latinized for his pen name. His as an author he used a Latinized version, Olaus, O-L-A-U-S, Petri, P-E-T-R-I. He and his brother, Lars was his brother, Lars Pearson, but his brother Latinized, again, his Latin pen name was Laurentius Petri. Okay, so the brothers, Olaf and Lars, were born in Örebro in south-central Sweden. Their father also was a blacksmith, Peter Olofsson, and his wife's name was Christina, meaning their mother's name was Christina. They were baptized Catholic. Sweden was a Catholic country. They attended Catholic school, which in the nearest one to them was a Carmelite, a school run by a Carmelite monastery. And that prepared them to attend University of Uppsala, UPPSALA, also in Sweden, where they studied theology and German. Then they went to Germany to attend the University of Leipzig. Then, in 1516, they transferred to the University of Wittenberg, where Luther and Melanchthon were on the faculty. So they transferred there 1 year before Luther nailed up the 95 Theses. So they were there when that happened. That's the doorbell, but this is a Monday morning. I'm doing this on Monday morning, so this is but the staff's here, so I don't have to stop for now. All right, the brothers studied under and were deeply influenced by both Luther and Melanchthon, completely absorbing Luther's theology, both the declarative, the sola scriptura, sola fide, scripture alone, faith alone, as well as the rejection, rejecting the saints, the devotion to saints, and prayers for the deceased, transubstantiation of the Eucharist, the authority of the papacy, etc. They completely internalized that. Olaf finished. He became a magister. He awarded his masters in February of 1518, the year after the 95 Theses, and Lars received his the next year, 1519, the year of the Leipzig disputation. So you had two more people who attended. They didn't participate in the debate, but they were there, along with Melanchthon. After that, they returned home to Sweden in the same year, 1519. Olaf was accepted into ecclesiastical service by the Most Reverend Matthias Gregerson, who was the bishop of the Diocese of Strängnäs. That's Strangnas. Bishop Gregerson ordained Olaf a deacon in 1520, appointed him chancellor of the diocese, and dean of the cathedral school. So just as the Protestant movement in Germany and Switzerland had been fueled by ambient nationalism, desiring liberation from the Holy Roman Empire, the German-dominated Holy Roman Empire, so also in Sweden, the Protestant movement would find support from those seeking liberation from Denmark. This state of affairs came about, ironically, also because of the Holy Roman Empire. In 1397, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden joined together in a political union named for the city where they made the agreement, the Kalmar Union, Kalmar. It included Norway's colonies, Iceland and Greenland, as well as Swedish territory that is in present-day Finland. So Scandinavia, in other words, the Kalmar Union was a political union of Scandinavia. This union was facilitated by intermarriages, again, the feudalism problem, political marriages, among the ruling houses of each of those realms. The impetus for joining was to counteract the political, economic, and military strength presented by the German-dominated Holy Roman Empire. So they didn't want to get absorbed into that. So they formed the Kalmar Union together. So they figured, okay, Scandinavians against Germans. By the time Olaf was ordained a deacon, however, the Swedish aristocracy chafed under the domination of the King of Denmark, King Christian II. Efforts by the Swedish nobility to limit King Christian's interference in Sweden led to Denmark invading Sweden in 1520, the year Olaf returned and was ordained a deacon. Okay, so the Kalmar Union, by the terms of the Kalmar Union, each of the realms, the Norway, Sweden, Denmark, were supposed to, be internally autonomous. So I hate to use this term because it's anachronistic, but it would be closer to a confederacy, a confederation, rather than a real union. However, over time, each of the realms, of course, they wanted to dominate the union, and so by the time that's relevant for us, Denmark was in the strongest position, and King Christian wanted to dominate. So in other words, he wanted to be the only king of the Kalmar Union, whereas the Swedish nobility didn't want that. Because they knew that would mean a loss of their own autonomy, so they resisted. So that led to war. All right, in 1520. The same year, Olaf returned and was ordained a deacon. So the connection between these developments, the connection of these developments to the church, is to be found in the person of Gustav Eriksson Trolle, Trolle, Archbishop of Uppsala in Sweden from 1514 to 1521. He was an ardent supporter of the Kalmar Union, so a unionist as opposed to the anti-unionist. His father, Eric, had served as a former regent of Sweden under the auspices of the Kalmar Union. So, his family benefited from the union, so obviously he's going to support the union. Gustav, being, from this important family, was sent to study in Germany and then to Rome in preparation for ecclesiastical life. He heavily influenced papal policy in favor of the union as the best means for the church to interact with Scandinavia and keeping it aligned with papal policies. Ordained a priest in 1513, Trolle returned to Sweden, and the following year, 1514, was ordained Archbishop of Uppsala, which was the proto-diocese of Sweden back from the 9th century. And at the time, it was the only metropolitan archdiocese in the entire country of Sweden. From this, so he's the senior ecclesiastic, in other words, the senior ecclesiastic in Sweden, just as the Archbishop of Canterbury would be in England. In this position, he naturally became embroiled in the dispute between the Swedish nationalist nobility on one side against those of his own thinking who were pro-union. Quickly perceiving his sympathies, there's no secret, the Swedish nationalist or the anti-unionist branded him a traitor to Sweden and a collaborator with the Danes against the interest of Sweden. In 1517, they, meaning the Swedish nationalists, the anti-unionist, the Sweden for the Swedes, that group, they assembled troops and they forcibly removed Tralla from office and destroyed, in the course of it, they destroyed the archbishop's residence. Naturally, Rome regarded this as uncanonical, schismatic, and criminal, which reinforced its existing view in favor of the Kalmar Union. So it's okay, the anti-unionists are the ones who did this, so they're the bad guys from Rome's perspective. So Rome is going to support the unionists, which means supporting Denmark. This attitude was regarded by Swedish nationalists as being, I mean, think of it on another level. From their perspective, this is a foreign pope siding with foreign Danes against the righteous aspirations of Swedes for control of Sweden, control of their own country. And that what they wanted, there was a precedent for what they wanted. Just as the Swiss fought to secede from the Holy Roman Empire in 1499 and achieve their independence, these Swedish anti-unionists wanted to secede from the Kalmar Union and Sweden just be an independent country. Nevertheless, because of the way the church first encountered the anti-unionists, they regarded them as criminals. So Pope Leo X gave his public support to King Christian II of Denmark invading Sweden in 1520 to return the legitimately ordained Catholic archbishop to the see of Uppsala, where, since he had been driven out by the anti-unionist. This was accomplished in the same year, and Archbishop Tralla returned to his see, crowned King Christian II of Denmark as King of Sweden on November 4th, 1520. The military success of King Christian was accomplished by using, in addition to Danish troops, he also used mercenaries who ethnically were French, Scottish, and German, providing yet another striking validation of the Swedish anti-unionist view of this as foreign suppression, imposing a foreign sovereign, and publicly approved in a ritual presided over by a Swedish collaborator representing a foreign Italian pope. So there's plenty of resentments, and mistrust going on for Satan to manipulate. Now, Pope Leo X, no doubt, he would have been astonished to hear this interpretation. From his perspective, he's supporting an archbishop. He's supporting Tralla, a guy who studied in Rome, was ordained, a priest in Rome. He was approved as Archbishop of Uppsala. He's okay. He's supporting his guy. All that was legitimate. Whereas the anti-unionist, driving by force, driving Tralla out and burning down his house, I mean, that's not legitimate. So all this, Leo, and of course, none of the people in the Vatican spoke Swedish. They didn't know any, so they really depended on the few people like Tralla who had gone to Rome to study. Anyway. So, of course, the Pope sided with Tralla against the anti-unionist. But the tragedy was not yet complete. I know you still wonder, well, okay, what is this? All right, an archbishop, but what does this have to do with the Protestant movement? Okay. Presently, King Christian II and Archbishop Tralla, after the coronation, invited the leaders of the defeated Swedish opposition to a conference in Stockholm, opening a few days later on November 7th, 1520. So Tralla crowned Christian on November 4th, and then invited all these people to Stockholm on November 7th. Ostensibly, the meeting was to work out the practical details of government. King Christian claimed that he would only govern Sweden indirectly through a council of regents consisting entirely of Swedes, employing Swedish customs and laws in exchange for Sweden recognizing him as ultimate sovereign. And, of course, submitting to tax theft, because that's, all governments do that. So this meeting seemed plausible, which is why so many attended, but it was a trap. King Christian, alas, with the connivance of Archbishop Trulla, had them arrested and placed on trial for heresy, schism, and sacrilege for having deposed an archbishop and destroyed church property, which they did. They had burned down the house, the archbishop's house. Now, not his personal dwelling, but the house of the archdiocese for use by its archbishops. Even though Archbishop Trulla was technically a plaintiff and a witness in the trial, nevertheless, he served as the presiding judge. So this was a farce. Of course, judicially, it was a charade, with the result inevitable. 62 of these Swedish, mostly nobles, not everyone was of the nobility, but they had been anti-unionist, anti-Kalmar Union. 62 were convicted and executed on November 9th. Another 82 were convicted and executed on November 10th, 1520. At this point, now it all comes together. At this point, Olaf Pearson re-enters our story. One of the Swedish leaders attending the Stockholm Conference was Deacon Olaf's patron, his bishop, Gregerson, of the Diocese of Stragnaris, the guy who ordained Olaf as a deacon, made him chancellor of the diocese and rector of the cathedral school. Bishop Gregerson had been aligned with the Swedish independence faction. He was arrested, executed after the farce trial, and Deacon Olaf was horrified by the purge. This is a purge, obviously. This is what's happening. And he only narrowly escaped capture himself. If he hadn't, he would have been killed too. He joined other survivors outside of the city, where a resistance movement coalesced into a second war against Denmark, this time with far more support from the average Swede to avenge a national atrocity. So it had more support than the previous dispute, which was just over the Kalmar Union. The leader of this second round of the Swedish independence movement was Gustav, and he later became king. So Gustav I of the House of Vasa, V-A-S-A. His father, Gustav's father, Eric, had also been among those captured and executed, along with Bishop Gregerson, at what was already being called the Stockholm bloodbath. So now, with all that background, you see, I know maybe I go into too much detail, but now it's obvious, isn't it? To just say in 1524 Sweden left the church, well, okay, then there's no understanding. But by now, do I even have to say it? That Sweden left the church. Of course they did. At this point, would be entirely without surprise to hear that Gustav Vasa, proved quite receptive to Olaf's summary of Lutheran criticisms of the Catholic Church. So, when Vasa led Sweden to victory in its war of independence against Denmark, and after being elected king himself by the Swedish nobility on June 6, 1523, Vasa led the country out of the Catholic Church with very little opposition among Swedes, owing to the perceived role of the church in the Stockholm bloodbath. On this basis, in 1524, now King Gustav I of Sweden severed diplomatic relations with the Holy See and proceeded to steal, or nationalize, as they would say, nationalize the property of the Catholic Church. So Henry VIII would be famous, more famous for this in the English-speaking world. with the dissolution of the monasteries, but he was not the first to do it. And so, of course, the Pope excommunicated him. So that's why 1524 is considered the date that Sweden left the Church. The Church of Sweden adopted justification by faith alone in sola scriptura, and it remains Lutheran in doctrine to this day. It's the Church of Sweden. And then later, in 1555, they adopted the Augsburg Confession, and we'll cover that context. But it's essentially Lutheranism. Okay, so another one. In the same year that Sweden left the Church, 1524, in the same year, in April of that year, the Habsburg-Valois Wars re-enter our story. A French army invaded northern Italy, again, to assert the Valois claim on Milan. Specifically, the city of Milan, but by extension, Milan was the ascendant city in Lombardy, that, the Lombard part of northern Italy. So, by taking over Milan, they were really they wanted to assert hegemony over Lombardy. But in April of 1524, that French army was defeated and forced to retreat back across the Alps. Pope Clement VII had initially allied himself with the French against the Habsburgs. All right, so he sided. Pope Clement sided, and the church policy then sided with the French Valois against the German Habsburgs, because Charles V was seen as being already too powerful, because he controlled all the Habsburg lands, the Austria and the Netherlands. He was Holy Roman Emperor, so at least he was suzerain, over Germany. Plus, he inherited Spain from his Trastamara mother. Spain and all the holdings in the New World, which means all the gold mines, that the Spanish had discovered in the New World. So Clement was afraid that if Charles succeeded and gained control over Lombardy, to the north, to northern Italy, that would be a threat to the independence of the Papal State. Therefore, he sided with France. But remember, what the public perception is: here's a pope, the leader of the Catholic Church, siding with one Catholic king against another Catholic king, for political reasons. When the French retreated, Clement then switched sides, just, as a practical measure, and he made a treaty with Charles V. But Charles V never forgot that the Pope had sided against him. Keep that in mind. On same year, July 1st, 1524, mercenaries, condottieri, Spanish and German mercenaries, who fill the ranks of Charles V's army in Italy, who had defeated the French, pursued the retreating French across the Alps, and then just blundered into a de facto invasion of southern France. So this imperial mercenary army laid siege to the southern French port city of Marseille, the port on the Mediterranean. Sieges, got boring, and they really could never have taken it because they didn't have any ships, and they could not have taken a port city because the siege, the success is you starve them out. Well, they could never starve out Marseille because it was a port, and they did not have the ships to blockade the port, so they got bored with the siege. And then, so these condottieri, even though they were both paid by the emperor, the troops it consisted of multiple ethnicities. Spanish mercenaries and German mercenaries then began fighting each other over access to local women and spoils taken from the surrounding countryside, meaning stuff they stole. The French garrison in Marseille perceived this, that their attackers were then, brawling among themselves. So they took the opportunity to sortie out and counterattack attacked their besiegers, and they successfully drove them out of France. Same year, August 1524, back to Germany. The South German region of Svabia and the Black Forest experienced it's called a Peasant Revolt. So many of these, as feudalism broke down, there would be peasant revolts in many of these European countries. Not every single one, but certainly in England they had more than one. France, Germany. This is one of them. Like the Taborite Hussites in Bohemia in the 14th century, this peasant uprising in Germany used anti-Catholic rhetoric to justify their violence. Yet that can only be understood in the broader context of an anti-authoritarian resentment by the peasants resenting the ascendant order of feudalism, in which hereditary aristocrats ran the world, controlled everything. Now, the connection of the church, why does that anti-authoritarianism get directed at the church also? Well, remember the feudalism problem. That same class of aristocrats are the ones who routinely sent their younger sons and extra daughters into the church without regard for their vocation. And those, since they were, from important families, wealthy families, those are the ones who tended to become abbots, bishops, cardinals, and for the ladies, those who would become prioresses and abbesses, in charge of convents and in charge of the land that these places were endowed with. So these the peasants' revolts were class resentment of the rigidity of feudalism, that you're born a peasant, okay, well then that's pretty much it, unless you go into the church or you become a soldier. But then even if you do that, even if you go into the church or become a soldier, if you're born a peasant, it's still going to be an aristocrat telling you what to do, because the bishop is probably a younger son of some duke. And certainly the general that you're fighting for, he's going to be the son of some aristocrat. So that's the connection. The anti-authoritarianism included resentment of the authority of the secular aristocracy as well as the ecclesial hierarchy. And this continued, like the French Revolution, the guillotine. That didn't just happen. That they didn't just decide in 1792, okay, let's start chopping off heads of aristocrats and bishops. That this is 200 years earlier. That's how long it took to break down feudalism. Okay. So in that sense, the August 1524 Peasants' Revolt in Germany was a political revolution against feudalism, which sought to replace both the existing ecclesiastical and secular hierarchies with an egalitarian village and city-state form of government. Each village would be independent, each city would be independent. Okay? The next month, September 1524, the apostate German priest whom we've already met, Thomas Müntzer, he was the proto-Anabaptist, led a separate peasants' revolt in central Germany by orchestrating riots and using the chaos of the riots as a cover for theft, for seizing the city of Mühlhausen, in the course of which the churches and the monasteries in the city were plundered. But the political element was revealed in that the local secular government was also overthrown and replaced with a council, a rebel council. The next month, October 1524, Münzer's Peasants' Revolt spread to Klettgau, which is further in southern Germany. Same month, October 26th, 1524, King Francis I of France. Remember, he's chafing because his army was defeated in northern Italy, and then by Charles's army, the Habsburg army, and then they laid siege to Marseille. Now, even though they got driven out, Francis still feels shamed by this and angry. So he perceives an opportunity. So now we have three separate revolutions going on in Germany. The August one in Svabia, the September one in Mühlhausen, and the October one in Klettgau. So Francis perceives an opportunity because all this is in Charles's territory in Germany. So Francis invaded Italy again, captured Milan in October 26th, and the next month sent 6,000 troops to go south to reclaim Naples. All right, so, I know you may be wondering, if it's France and Germany who are at war with each other, why do they keep fighting in Italy? Well, it's because both the Valois and the Habsburg had dynastic claims. They could legitimately claim, well, look, my ancestors married this person and this person and this person, so Lombardy should actually be part of France. Whereas the Habsburgs could say the same thing. Well, we had ancestors who married this person and that person and that person, so it should be part of Austria, or at least part of Habsburg lands. So that's why they both keep it's colonialism. But it's internal colonialism in the sense it's internal to Europe. But they both want colonies because if whichever one achieved that, Lombardy would be subordinate, whether it was attached to France or Germany. So it's colonialism. And exactly what Clement was afraid of would happen. Having achieved victory in Lombardy, then the French marched south through the Papal State to go to Naples, which is southern Italy. So then you'd have the same power dominating both ends of both frontiers of the Papal State. So Pope Clement switched sides again, abandoning Charles and allying with Francis. So this is the second time he sided against Charles. The next month, November 17th, 1524, Luther succeeded in abolishing the Mass in Wittenberg. Since his excommunication, Luther would have been subject to arrest and execution, by any Catholic power. But he was protected by his local secular lord, the Elector Frederick of Saxony, one of the 7 imperial electors. Luther and his preacher recruits preached violent anti-clerical sermons in order to mobilize the local population to turn on the remaining clergy and religious. In November, Luther delivered a sermon in which he characterized the Mass as, quote, blasphemous, madness, and a lie, worse than murder or robbery, and urged all princes, rulers, burgomeisters, councillors, and judges to stop it. Lutheran mobs then began harassment of the last remaining church in Wittenberg. The local Catholics followed proper procedure. They went to their local lord for protection. Their local lord was the Elector Frederick. They asked, for restoration of public order and that he protect them. That's part of feudalism. So you accept, okay, he's the Lord, and I owe him. I'm a vassal. I have to do what he says, but then he owes me protection. But the Elector, by this point, had become a Lutheran, so he refused to protect the Catholic Mass. So before Christmas, the Catholics. So again, everybody has to make a choice. Catholics who refuse to become Lutheran or to give up the sacraments, then just had to leave. They just evacuated Wittenberg. The next month, December 1524, Munzer and the Anabaptist revolutionaries abolished the Mass in Mühlhausen, and so they achieved the same. so that was a massless Christmas in at least those two places in Germany. Always something, I tell you. No. January, the next year, January 25th, 1525, Charles V retaliated. He sent a fresh condottieri army. Condottieri are mercenaries, remember? That's from the Italian word for contract. So they're mercenaries. He sent a fresh condottieri army to Italy to defend his dynastic claims over Milan. All right, now think about this. This guy has at least 3 separate revolutions going on in Germany. And he's the Holy Roman Emperor, so Germany, he's responsible for public order in Germany. He spends the money and resources to raise a condottieri army, a mercenary army, but instead of using them to restore public order in his own realm, he instead uses them to pursue colonialism, to invade Italy, to pursue his family's claim on Lombardy. So, as I said, Charles made mistakes, and this is one of them. The priorities were all screwed up. His troops engaged the French at Pavia in Lombardy and achieved victory, a decisive victory, which included capturing King Francis I and holding him for a ransom, a staggering, crippling ransom. So captured Francis on February 24th, 1525. Pope Clement was allied to Francis, so now Pope Clement switched sides again, abandoning Francis and allying with Charles. March of the same year, 1525, was the formation of the Christian Union of Svabia. So now at this point, we start to see different terminology used. So prior to this, the term Catholic and Christian were not in opposition to each other. But from this point on, in Protestant usage, Christian was something distinct from Catholic. So when a Protestant refers to themselves as Christian, they did not understand Catholics as being Christian. Because they accuse us of idolatry and paganism and all. So they say, well, okay, essentially you're worshiping false gods, so you're not Christian. So that's what this, the Christian Union of Svabia, led by another guy. This guy is Sebastian Lotzer, Lotzer. This Christian Union published 25,000 copies of a pamphlet titled 12 Articles for the Exaltation of the Evangel and the Execution of Divine Justice. So the evangel is, that became the term of art that the Protestants would use to refer to the gospel, the evangel. Articles 1, 2, 3, and 12 were explicitly Lutheran, meaning abolition of all financial transactions with the Holy See, elimination of monasteries, convents, elimination of monasticism as a way of life, elimination of the Catholic hierarchy. Each parish would elect its own pastor, and all laws must be based on the Gospels, the Evangel. The balance of the articles dealt with secular matters, elimination of the secular nobility, and elimination of hereditary rule, hereditary aristocracy and royalty. So in that part, Munzer differed from Luther, as Luther consistently defended hereditary nobility because their survival depended on their protection. But you see here, 200 years earlier, we have a prelude to the French Revolution. Attack, both upon the ecclesiastical order and the secular order. The Anabaptist violence spread. Churches, monasteries, convents were destroyed, along with castles of the nobility. In April of 1525, Munzer wrote to rebels in Mansfeld, quote, "Keep your swords warm with the blood of tyrants." Luther publicly repudiated Munzer's revolutionary ideology. He condemned the Peasant Revolts. Yet those words used by Munzer echoed Luther's own pamphlet from 5 years earlier, his address to the Christian nobility of the German nation. Quote, this is Luther's words: "If we punish thieves with gallows, robbers with the sword, heretics with fire, why should we not, all the more, assail with arms these masters of perdition, these cardinals, these popes, the whole dregs of the Roman Sodom, who have been corrupting the church of God without intermission, and wash our hands in their blood." So that was 5 years earlier. So stoking up emotion, but that was before the violence started. Well, now, then Luther by 1525 sees the fruits of that. You sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. And a lot of people were taking that seriously. And now, at least 3 violent civil wars going on in Germany. So then Luther backtracks and he sides with public order and condemns the Peasant Revolts. April 10th, 1525. Duke Albrecht of Brandenburg, Grand Master of the Teutonic Knights, one of the military religious orders from the 13th century, abandoned Catholicism, left the church, secularized the Ordensstadt lands into the Lutheran Duchy of Prussia, North Germany, with the capital at Berlin. All right, so remember from the medieval course that after the fall of the Holy Land, all these military religious orders had to find another purpose. And the Teutonic Knights took as their purpose waging war against the Prussia, hence the name Prussia. They were the local tribe in the area that were still pagan. And the Teutonic Knights exterminated them, so the only remembrance of that is the name Prussia. And the territory that they conquered, they turned it into the order state, the Ordensstadt, meaning a political entity that was controlled as essentially a country by the religious order. So on April 10th, 1525, the Grand Master happened to also be the Duke of Brandenburg, so he left the church. So the Duchy of Brandenburg becomes Lutheran, but he also leads the Teutonic Knights out of the church. So they're still Teutonic Knights, but they were no longer a Catholic religious order. All right. And this also explains the union of Brandenburg with the Ordensstadt into the Duchy of Prussia accounts for, from this point on, the heritage of militarism that characterized North German culture as distinct from South German culture. So the culture of Germany for the next centuries, the culture in Prussia in North Germany would be very different from that of Bavaria in South Germany. The next day, April 11th, a Lutheran preacher named Johann Schwanhauser led a fourth revolt in Germany, which looted the cathedral and the bishop's residence in Bamberg, which is near Nuremberg. The next day, 5th uprising, April 12th, Georg Metzler led another one of these peasants' uprisings in Odenwald, which is central Germany, near Würzburg. Did the same thing, sacked the church, looted the church and the residence, and a convent in Liechtenstein. He used the convent as a prison for some lay aristocrats he captured. He captured 4 counts on that day and just put them in jail. So again, a prelude to the French Revolution. The next day, April 13th, happened to be Holy Thursday. Zwingli in Switzerland, remember him, Ulrich Zwingli? He succeeded in abolishing the Mass in Zurich. So no Mass on Holy Thursday, replacing it with the Lord's Commemoration. The next day, April 14th, was Good Friday. Metzler continued the expanding his peasants' uprising, plundering in Weinsberg, which at the time was a separate kingdom, a German kingdom of Wittenberg, where they murdered the ruling family. So they not only looted ecclesial lands and killed priests and anyone they got their hands on, but also the ruling family. So again, the political and the ecclesial are united. This was the dynasty was the House of Helfenstein. 3 days later, April 17th, another Lutheran preacher, Gerhard Westerberg, led an uprising. Another one, so what are we up to, 6 now, that seized the city of Frankfurt on the Main River. The next day, April 18th, back to Metzler. He spread, did a raid, essentially an invasion, a capture of Heilbronn, where the bishop and the priest who remained with the bishop were murdered in the church, and the church was plundered. April 25th, back in the Schwarzwald, the Black Forest, the Munzer's group took Stuttgart. And on April 28th, they took Erfurt, looting everything, driving out both secular leaders as well as ecclesial. The following month, May 4th, 1525, Luther came out publicly in writing this time, publishing a pamphlet titled "Against the Murderous, Thieving Hordes of Peasants," unquote, in which he called on secular leaders to hew them down like mad dogs. So you see, even though 5 years earlier he contributed to stoking that emotion, but then he saw, once you light a match, it might become a forest fire. Or as St. Thomas More would later say, you cannot push a man off a cliff and tell him to stop halfway down. So now then he turns all right. May 12, 1525. An army of condottieri, as well as local militia, led by Georg von Waldberg, decisively engaged and defeated a peasant army of revolutionaries numbering 10,000 at the Battle of Boblingen, Boblingen, in Germany. May 15th, 1525. Another army of the nobility, they finally realized what a threat was going on. So they engaged a second of the uprisings. This was Munzer himself at the Battle of Frankenhausen. He was defeated, captured, and executed. Now, supposedly, he was reconciled with the church before his execution. May 24th, 1525. A third rebel army struck back, capturing Freiburg, leveling the cathedral with an artillery barrage. October 31st, 1525. This is the anniversary of the 95 Theses, the vigil of All Saints' Day. Luther wrote to the elector John Frederick of Saxony, changing his original ecclesiology of congregational government to one of a state-run church. It would be called Erastianism, based on a different thinker, Thomas Erastes, out of a need for protection. Meaning that Luther embraced a nationalist ecclesiology, that the church in a given country should be functionally a department of state of that country, and the clergy function as civil servants in support of public order and support of the government, and then in return would be on the payroll of the government. December 1525. The last of the revolts, 6, I think we were up to, 6 different rebel formations. They had finally been put down. But Germany would never again be completely Catholic, and it's still not to this day. Same year, 1525, William Tyndale, that's Tyndale, he translated the New Testament, and it was printed in, he was English, but it had to be printed in Worms, this is significant, this William Tyndale's New Testament is significant because it was a step toward the King James Bible, meaning in English, but it's still too early because England was still Catholic at this point. Okay. Same year, 1525, Luther gets married. He marries a former nun, Catherine von Bora. Following year, 1526, Pope Clement turned on Charles V again. What are we up to, the third time? This time by joining a league of Italian city-states which attacked Charles's army in Italy because Clement wasn't the only one who did not want the Habsburgs, to have a permanent military presence in northern Italy. Now this time, Charles totally lost his temper, both with the League of City-States as well as with Clement. Charles retaliated by forming an alliance with the Italian House of Colonna against the Holy See, which they were happy to join because the House of Colonna was a rival house to the House of Medici, which, of course, the Pope was a Medici. August 26th, 1526, the third strain we're following, the Islam. On that date, the Battle of Mohacs occurred, Mohaccs. It's in Hungary. It has nothing to do with the Mohawk Indians in the United States. It just happens to sound that way. At that battle, an Ottoman army, a Turkish Islamic army, consisting of 100,000 men and 300 cannon, took advantage of Western infighting to continue from Hungary. They had already invaded Hungary and taken up to the Danube River. So Budapest, the Danube River goes through Budapest. Buda is on one side, Pest is on the other side of the river. So the Muslims had taken up to the river. And then in 26, they cross over to continue the expansion. Same year, back in Italy, September 20th, 1526, the House Colonna joined with condottieri, mercenaries paid for by Emperor Charles V, and entered the city of Rome. Pope Clement panicked when it became clear that the population of the city was not going to lift a finger in his defense. From their perspective, from the perspective of the people in the city, this was just one more of many instances of the various Italian houses engaging in a power struggle with the Pope, so not their concern. Besides, Clement was not Roman. He was from Florence. And we think of Italy as just being Italy, as a one country. Remember, it's not a unified country at this point. So someone would, if you asked them where they're from, like Clement would not have said, "I'm from Italy." He would have said, "I'm from Florence." And the people born in Rome would have said that too. They would not have said, "I'm from Italy." They would have said, "I'm from Rome." Clement, in this extremity, took refuge in the Castle San Angelo within sight of the Vatican. So he watched in shame and helplessness as the Colonna and Charles's condottieri looted the Vatican Palace and the partially constructed St. Peter's Basilica. Pope Clement had to pay a bribe, or protection money, whatever you want to call it, pay 30,000 ducats. Ducats were gold coins minted in Venice, so it's a lot of money. Pay them off, and agree to issue an amnesty for the House Colonna as well as all their allies in order for them to leave Rome and allow him to leave the Castle San Angelo safely and return to the Vatican. At this point, the imperial forces in Italy, Charles's forces in Italy, consisted of 50,000 troops under the command of a French condottiero named Charles de Bourbon. He's a member of the Bourbon, the Bourbon dynasty that would rule France. Another 6,000 Dutch cavalry, mercenaries, under the command of Philibert, Prince of Orange. Another 18,000 German condottieri, bizarrely, under the command of a Lutheran, even though this is Charles's army, and Charles remained Catholic. But those 18,000 were under the command of a Lutheran, Georg Frundsberg. He was a prince of Mindelheim, Germany, who had embraced Lutheranism. Another 10,000 Spanish infantry under the command of the Marquis del Vasto. Another 6,000 Italian condottieri under the command of Fernando Gonzaga. And 8,000 Swiss pikemen. All these guys had to be paid as the mercenaries. That's condottieri. That's what it means, contract. So that's it. You got to pay all these guys. And that's the background for the next act in the tragedy. March 8th, 1527. This imperial army, needing funds to pay all the troops, so they didn't kill their officers, made contact with the Pope, demanding another 60,000 gold pieces in protection money. And they said, this is to protect you from Rome being raided. And Clement did it. He paid it off. So he had paid 30,000 ducats in 26. Now in 27, in March of 27, he pays 60,000 ducats. The following month, April 3rd, 1527, the same army made a demand for an additional 80,000 ducats, gold coins, and Clement paid. Then on April 26th, 1527, de Bourbon demanded another 150,000 gold ducats in protection money. But by this point, the papal treasury was empty. Clement said, okay, that's it. I just don't have any more gold coins. So de Bourbon, in order to keep the imperial army of mercenaries from mutiny, decided to sack Rome. Charles V, who employed this army, was not present. He wasn't even in Italy. He was in Spain. He did not know anything about this at the time. But in the end, his failure to redirect them out of Italy and into Germany or Hungary against the Islamic invasion. So he has a civil war going on in Germany and an Islamic invasion. Now, he was not king of Hungary, but still, the Danube eventually made it into his territory because just as the Danube went through Budapest, it also went through Vienna, which was certainly in Habsburg territory. So, I mean, having all those troops, all that, in Italy pursuing essentially a colonial agenda and ignoring the civil war on his home turf and a potential invasion, not potential, an invasion that was taking place by Islam. The following month, May 4th, 1527, Charles de Bourbon appeared before the walls of Rome with the army, demanding 300,000 ducats as a ransom to spare the city. And Clement said, I don't have it. So, at 6 a.m. on May 6th, 1527, the imperial army of the officially Catholic Holy Roman Emperor stormed the city of Rome. The carnage was terrible. Indiscriminate burning, pillaging, rape, desecration, mass murders were described by survivors. The Swiss Guard saved Clement's life, as they had saved Alexander VI's life and Julius II's life by getting him out of the Castle San Angelo. So one unit of the Swiss Guard sacrificed themselves. They barricaded themselves inside of St. Peter's, and they put up the papal flag, so to make the invaders think that the Pope was making his last stand in St. Peter's. And then they started talking trash, well, you're never going to get, to draw the attention to themselves, while another unit had, snuck the Pope out in disguise to the Castle San Angelo. And those guards at St. Peter's, they fought to the death. Eventually, the numbers just overwhelmed them. And then the mercenaries made it into St. Peter's and saw that Clement was never there. So Clement's life was saved. The bulk of the guards left behind to die. So Clement was physically safe, as the Castle San Angelo was well stocked and it was well fortified. But he had to listen. He was trapped there. He had to listen to the screams, watch the fires as the population of Rome was put to torture, rape, and murder. Churches were plundered. Clergy and religious, nuns in particular, were brutalized and murdered. The great golden cross of Constantine was looted from St. Peter's, disappeared from history, probably melted down. The Lutheran mercenaries in the imperial army then declared that Martin Luther was Pope. They proclaimed that in the desecrated husk of St. Peter's Basilica. The pillaging eventually lost energy, but the thousands of decomposing corpses in the city released plague, or cholera, which multiplied the body count. Charles V was at Valladolid in Spain when he learned of the sack. So he had to send more troops with more money to, in effect, bribe his own army in Italy to allow the Pope to go free on December 6, 1527. So Luther was not the only one who sowed the wind and then reaped the whirlwind. So we see both Clement and Charles did the same thing. They set into motion a sequence of events without thinking the matter through, not considering just how bad it could get. Now, I know nobody can foresee the futures, but it is reasonable, to conjecture the possibility that if you engage in, colonial warfare, that bad things are going to happen to innocent people. So Clement fled Rome. He went to Orvieto, 60 miles away. It was there, while he was in Orvieto, after experiencing all of this, that Clement received a petition from King Henry VIII of England, asking the Pope to end his marriage to his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Why is this significant? Because Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, whose army had just sacked Rome, and who had just permitted Clement to live by abandoning Rome. So now Henry is asking Clement to preside over the public humiliation of Charles's aunt by ending the marriage with Henry VIII. So there was no possibility that Clement could do that, even if it had been canonically legitimate to do, which it wasn't. So anyway, and we're going to see the effect of that in due course. For the remaining 7 years of his pontificate, Pope Clement VII did not dare anything that might risk another conflict with Charles V. After witnessing the sack of Rome from the tower of the fortress of the Castle San Angelo, he was never the same. He became incapable of formulating any plan of action. We had some kind of collapse, some internal, breakdown. In retrospect, it would have been better for the church if he had just abdicated, as Pope Gregory XII had. But Clement was not the man Gregory had been, and so the hemorrhage continued. Same year, 1527. So we've seen Satan, having his field day. But the Spirit, was also with us. Oh, no, I got to do something before that. Okay, same year, 1527. This is a cultural thing. A guy I alluded to earlier, and now we see him in context. Baldassare Castiglione, Castiglione. He published his book titled The Courtier in 1527. It became a handbook of aristocratic manners. Castiglione was himself born a nobleman, an Italian nobleman, but he was impoverished. But he used his name, and he rented out his services as a diplomatic mercenary. He was multilingual, and he earned quite the reputation for success as a negotiator. That gave his book credibility and resulted in the display of refinement and manners in diplomatic and high society. So it was kind of like a self-improvement book, but also one of these success books, like a how-to success book. It's how to be successful in business and diplomacy. And now diplomats, remember, they in this context they would negotiate trade. They would deal with bankers. It wasn't just political. Of course, that was involved, but it was. And so his the premise is that success. That the way one behaves, the way one dresses, the way one comports oneself are all factors in contributing to success, and can even compensate for or even nullify certain disadvantages that the representative of a particular city or country might have. So if you're negotiating with someone who has more money or has more power, But if you can present yourself well, and you think well on your feet, and to give people an impression of you that you are stronger than you really are, and then by extension the people you represent are stronger than they may previously have thought they were, then that's one way you achieve success. So that it may sound kind of trivial, manners, how one behaves, but it did affect things. So it's written as a dialogue. See, the Ghost of Plato, another dialogue. It was written as a dialogue at the court of Urbino, which we visited previously during the life of the artist Raphael. The book presented a model for civic humanism. That, as with all the humanists, they all read the Greco-Roman classics. In this case, it was heavily influenced by a treatise of Cicero titled On Duty, De Officiis. The purpose of Castiglione's courtier would be to describe and therefore provide a way for others to emulate an ideal Renaissance gentleman. This was not self-cultivation for its own sake, but rather to engage in public service, in business, in the arts. The successful courtier, the successful Renaissance gentleman, must have the respect of his peers in order to succeed. He must be known for discretion in order to be trusted. He must be respected for his wisdom in giving honest, non-self-interested counsel. He must be accomplished in body. So if necessary, he must be able to fight on the battlefield. He must be accomplished in sports, in dancing, because that was part of diplomacy. It was very ritualized, formal dancing that they would do. And if you go to the court, to talk to some duke, well, you have to go to those things. He must be accomplished in mind. The gentleman must be multilingual, built on Latin and Greek. He must be conversant in literature, poetry, music, as well as politics, economics, architecture, engineering. Moreover, the gentleman, the courtier, must excel in all of these endeavors without apparent effort, but rather make it appear as if he were just naturally that good, make it look easy. So to summarize this quality, Castiglione coined a term, an Italian word, sprezzatura, S-P-R-E-Z-Z-A-T-U-R-A, which he defined as, quote, a certain nonchalance, so as to conceal all art and make whatever one does or says to appear to be without effort, almost without any thought at all. End quote. It is the ability of the courtier to display, another quote, an easy facility in accomplishing difficult actions, which hides the conscious effort that went into them. The Renaissance gentleman, the courtier, must speak gracefully and appropriately with people of all stations in life. He must have impeccable taste in food, clothing, wine, the arts. He must be equally ready to mount his horse for battle, or compose a poem, or conduct complex trade negotiations. Despite his talents and success, he's never arrogant, but always polite, always gracious to all he meets, regardless of their station in life. At the same time, he is firm and resolute in any task he undertakes. So, in other words, he doesn't exist. I mean, just to be real, but it's an ideal. Just like in the Middle Ages, in the medieval course, we talked about knighthood. How that was an ideal, the chivalry, that was an ideal. I mean, how many people really lived up to every single ideal of chivalry? Probably not that many. And the same with this. But the ideals were known, and it was part of the culture. So just as in the Middle Ages, the ideal of knighthood was known and respected, and it was part of the culture. So in this case, the courtier, the Renaissance gentleman, the idea of a gentleman, that became known. And even though there are few who would fulfill every single one of these, characteristics, because it was part of the culture, it was the way children would be raised. So they would have some of these characteristics, and therefore, it affected the culture. So it proved to be a publishing phenomenon. Within Castiglione's lifetime, it was translated into Spanish, German, French, Polish, and English. And of course, it was already in Italian and Latin. 108 editions were published between 1528 and 1616 alone. Its depiction of the Renaissance gentleman became the standard training for behavior among the upper classes of Europe, as well as the successful middle class who tried to imitate them. Its influence can be seen from Shakespeare through the BBC Masterpiece Theater, historical dramas, all the way up to Emily Post's Book of Etiquette. So it did have an influence. Okay, now we'll get to what I was talking about earlier, the action of the Holy Spirit in this time. In the following year, 1528, Father Matteo Serafini of Bascia, Bascia, that's a town in Italy. He was an Italian. He was an observant Franciscan friar. He decided to pursue a stricter and more faithful adherence to the example of St. Francis. The observant Franciscans, which he was initially a member of, did observe personal and corporate poverty. But they did permit secular agents to own property and administer income in the name of the priory. So Father Matteo came to regard this as a dishonest dodge to get around the ideal of corporate poverty. And he wanted to return to literal observance of both individual and corporate poverty, living only on daily alms, daily charity. On July 3rd, 1528, Pope Clement VII granted permission for him to create the Order of Friars Minor Capuchin. So OFM, that's Franciscan, that's what he originally was, but Capuchin to distinguish, so this is another group of Franciscans. The name Capuchin is derived from the Italian word cappuccino, which I know it's associated with a particular kind of coffee, but that's because of the color of the cappuccino. The original word, the cappuccio, described the type of long pointed hood, brown hood that they wore, which the Capuchins wore, which Father Matteo believed to have been what St. Francis wore. So cappuccio, then, but because of the brown color, then you have the cappuccino. Okay. This order, the Capuchins, would one day have an important role in the French and Spanish American colonies. They practiced both individual and corporate poverty, refusing to own even the churches, hospitals, and schools they served, which included our cathedral in New Orleans, the St. Louis Cathedral in New Orleans. And this would one day open those parishes and our cathedral to domination by lay trustees in the United States. And we'll talk about that in the fourth-year course in U.S. Catholicism. Same year, 1528, back to England. Henry VIII, the second Tudor monarch of England, explained to the secular and ecclesiastical lords of England his motives for seeking a decree annulling his, by then, 19-year marriage to Catherine of Aragon. He had married her in 1509. He informed the lords that the union was incestuous, which means he rejected the validity of the dispensation granted on June 11th, 1509, for him to marry his late brother's widow. We covered that in the previous lecture. Meaning he rejected the grounds on which it was based, which was Catherine's testimony that her marriage to Arthur Henry's older brother, had never been consummated. Remember, they were married young, and they got sick when they went to Wales. And Arthur died of the illness. Catherine recovered, but she said, that the marriage was never consummated. On that basis, the Pope granted a dispensation for her to marry Henry. So by Henry rejecting that, he's essentially accusing Catherine of being a liar. So various strategies were suggested about how Henry could deal with this, because he wanted to get rid of her in order to marry a younger woman, Anne Boleyn, because he wanted to have a son. He had one daughter with Catherine. Well, they had 6 children, but only one survived to adulthood, the daughter, Mary. So various strategies were suggested to enable him to dump her and marry Anne Boleyn. One strategy would be to dispense Henry from the requirement of monogamy, to let him be a bigamist and have 2 wives. A second would be for Catherine to voluntarily abdicate and enter a convent. Third would be formal nullification of the marriage. But that would antagonize her nephew, Charles V, the most powerful man in Europe. And since Charles had just sacked the city of Rome, and the Pope was on the run and hiding at Orvieto, that there was zero chance that he would do that. The 2 royal servants in England who were the most responsible for encouraging Henry to act as he did, and which brought the Protestant movement to yet another country, to England, were the 2 Thomases, Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. Thomas Cranmer became Archbishop of Canterbury, and Thomas Cromwell was born a commoner, but eventually became Earl of Essex and the Lord Privy Seal, the head of the Royal Council. Cranmer was a professor of theology at Cambridge University when the King's Great Matter was being argued. That's what they call the divorce. As early as 1529, Cranmer argued that the king was the protector of the church, and that he should appoint a group of theologians from the realm to advise him, and then act on that advice with regard to the marriage, and then without any need to consult the Pope. Cranmer presented this as if it were a new idea, but as we've seen in the medieval course, that this is just Gallicanism. This is the national church ecclesiology. And that argument had been asserted in France as early as 1438. Arguing that the supremacy of the state over the church. And that even was not new. That was based on earlier arguments by Marsilius of Padua in 1324 in his book titled Defender of the Peace. And, of course, Luther had also used that political ideology in replacing his original idea of a congregational ecclesiology with the state church idea. Henry was impressed with anything that inflated his already monumental sense of self-importance. So he sent Cranmer to Germany in hopes that Charles V could be persuaded to tell the Pope it was okay for him to nullify the marriage of Henry with Catherine. Now, Charles had no interest in speaking to Cranmer. There's no evidence that they even met. But while in Germany, Cranmer met and befriended many early Protestants and secretly married one of them. In 1532, he married Margaret Osiander, who was the daughter of a Lutheran, Andreas Osiander. That same year, 1532, the Archbishop of Canterbury died at the age of 82. That was William Warham. Pope Clement VII, hoping to placate Henry, as he knew he couldn't nullify the marriage, but he wanted to give Henry something, so accepted Henry's nomination of Cranmer to replace William Warham, even though Cranmer was totally unknown in Rome. And, of course, Rome didn't know that he was secretly married. So Cranmer's consecration as Archbishop of Canterbury was invalid because he was secretly married. But anyway, that's what happened. In 1528, the Protestant movement spread to yet another country, this time Scotland. Scotland, as we saw in the medieval course, had been evangelized by St. Columba, an Irish Celtic missionary, who established the monastery on the island of Iona as the base from which the conversion of the pagan Picts, P-I-C-T-S, Picts of Caledonia took place. That's present-day Scotland. And that was in the 6th century, around 560 to 590. The heretical views of John Wycliffe had manifested in the Scottish universities of St. Andrews, Glasgow, Aberdeen, predisposing at least part of the intellectual population to anti-clericalism and ecclesial nationalism. In 1528, a Scot named Patrick Hamilton, who had studied in Germany under Luther, like Olaf Pearson and others, was captured and burned at the stake at St. Andrews. This is taken by Scottish historians as the beginning of the Protestant movement in Scotland. In its first manifestation, it was Lutheran. And as occurred in all the other countries where it appeared, it would be responsible for a civil war in Scotland. But in the end, the secular lords supporting the movement defeated the Catholics. Mitosis occurred. And in the next generation of Scottish Protestants regarded Lutheranism as insufficiently reformed. So the Church of Scotland embraced another version of the Protestant movement, John Calvin's version, which we'll get to, Calvinism. To jump out of the chronology, in 1560, under the leadership of another former priest who left the church named John Knox, K-N-O-X, the Church of Scotland became officially Presbyterian, which is Calvinist. And that espoused a congregational ecclesiology based on the assertion of the priesthood of all believers, as well as an extreme predestination soteriology. Okay, let me see something. I got to pause for a second. Okay, back. Sorry about that. My voice was giving out. I had to get some water. Okay, so February through April of 1529, we have another diet, another meeting in the Holy Roman Empire. This one took place at Speyer, S-P-E-Y-E-R, from February through April 1529. This one is significant historically because it is the origin of the term Protestant. Now, I've been using the term just because that's what we know, but this is why we know it. This is where the term was first used. So Emperor Charles V summoned the Diet to meet at Speyer beginning on February 21st, 1529. Charles wanted the Diet to vote to end legal toleration for Lutherans in Germany. As we've seen, Luther was protected, at least in Saxony, and by the Elector of Saxony, and also in Brandenburg, once the Teutonic Knights Lutheranized the Ordenstadt. Now, the Anabaptists were already considered criminals and rebels because of the Peasants' War, but the Lutherans did have protection from some secular rulers. So Charles wanted everyone to agree to pressure all those rulers who were protecting the Lutherans to withdraw their protection, so that they could be arrested and they'd be charged with heresy. And so they would be given a chance to recant, and if they didn't, well, they would have been executed by incineration. Well, six of the Charles knew about two of them, but it turned out that at this meeting, 6 of the rulers in Germany and 14 of the city councils in the imperial cities were Lutheran. And together they signed a document called a protest in Latin, the Protestatio, against this action of Charles, or attempted action, because it was never done. And they made an argument, the protesters made an argument in favor of freedom of conscience, along with a contradictory argument that each ruler should have the right to impose his own religion on his territory. Okay, now a reminder from the medieval course. Remember, again, Germany is a term I've been using for convenience, but at this period, Germany was not a united nation. It did not become a united nation until 1870. At this period, there were over 300 sovereignties in Germany, ranging in size. They had different titles: baronies, landgrave, margrave, count, dukes, princes, even a few kings. And they were all constituent members of the Holy Roman Empire, but internally they were autonomous. So those who signed this protest, the 6 Lutheran rulers and the 14 representatives of city councils, 14 city councils, argued first in freedom of conscience, that the Diet should not impose Catholicism on people who wanted to be Lutheran. Yet they also argued that each ruler should be able, should decide what the religion of his state was. So that, of course, is contradictory. So the freedom of conscience only applied when the emperor wanted to force people to be Catholic, but it would not apply if a Lutheran ruler wanted to force the people in his territory to be Lutheran. The term Protestant came from this context, as they sabotaged the Diet of Speyer by constant interrupting and shouting down every item on the agenda so nothing could ever come to vote. So the Diet of Speyer broke up without accomplishing anything except that one change to history. So it gave the movement its name, the protest movement, the Protestant movement. Same year, 1529, October 1st through October 3rd. I should say. So this was considered by the Lutherans a victory, the sabotaging of the Diet of Speyer. It prompted some of the Lutheran leaders in Germany to seek unification of the Protestant movement against what they expected would be retaliation by the Emperor Charles V. To that end, Philip, the Landgrave of Hesse, hosted a meeting between Luther and Zwingli in order to unite the German and the Swiss versions of the Protestant movement. The meeting took place in Marburg, where Philip had established the first Protestant university only 2 years earlier, in 1527. At this meeting, which was called a colloquy, the Marburg Colloquy, a list of 15 core beliefs was generated, called the Marburg Articles, in the hope that if both Luther and Zwingli signed them, that unity among anti-Catholics could be achieved. Agreement between Luther and Zwingli was achieved on 14 of the 15 points. But the Marburg Colloquy ended in failure because of the 15th, which pertained to the Eucharist, the Mass. Luther, though he reviled Catholics for using the non-biblical term transubstantiation to describe the miracle that takes place at each Mass, proceeded to invent his own non-biblical term to describe it. He called it consubstantiation. Luther argued using the analogy of iron put into a fire, that both fire and iron are united in the red-hot iron, yet each continues to exist. Like the fire is still fire, the iron is still iron. But so there is a change in that the iron becomes red hot because of the heat. But he says the fire does not cease to be fire, the iron does not cease to be iron. So that was his. He said, okay, that the bread and wine continue to be bread and wine. Now they're exposed to the grace, that comes, but they still remain bread and wine, which is, so in that he differed from the church. The Catholic view is the transubstantiation is that it becomes a body, blood, soul, and divinity. of Jesus Christ. And that there is no scientific explanation for that, because it's not a natural act. It is a supernatural act. It's a miracle. But anyway, so that's where Luther's differ. Zwingli, on the other hand, the Swiss Protestant leader, favored a purely, entirely symbolic view of the Eucharist. That when he saw that that whatever miraculous grace occurred, that was just at the Last Supper. So what the faithful do when they reenact it is just a commemoration. It's a community action. So now he would, that wherever two or three are gathered, there. So they would see that biblical verse that Christ is present, but not in the sacramental understanding of the Catholic Church as the real presence. And so this reveals the essential subjectivity of the Protestant theology. Because ultimately it's their conscience, that they each. That's what makes their decision. That not reference to the magisterium of the Catholic Church. And there was also personality. These are two very strong, stubborn individuals, and that precluded the possibility of agreement. But the 15 Articles were kept, even though it didn't accomplish its original purpose. But the Articles were kept by Luther, and later they became the basis for the Augsburg Confession, 26 years later in 1555, which became essentially the constitution of the state of Lutheranism as a state religion, one of the state religions in Germany. 1529. Father Bernardino de Sahagún, S-A-H-A-G-U-N. He was a Franciscan. He initiated the Franciscan mission in Mexico, which was at the time, of course, had been conquered by Spain, and it was considered New Spain by Spain. By the royal, like on Spanish imperial maps, it wasn't called Mexico, it was called New Spain. Bernardino was born in Sahagún in what had been the Kingdom of Leon prior to unification. Subsequently, it was joined to Aragon and later just became a constituent of Spain, of United Spain. He completed his theological education at Salamanca. In 1529, he led the first contingent of Franciscan missionaries to the newly conquered Aztec Empire of Mexico. Now, he was not the first Franciscan there, but Franciscans had been present as chaplains to the Spanish, but Sahagún was ordered to lead the first organized effort of the Franciscans as an order to be missionaries to the survivors of the former Aztec Empire. He proved to be a language prodigy, learning the indigenous languages, compiling notes on the history, the culture of the region. These were published long after his death. I mean, he initially did it just for other friars so that they could prepare, but they were published later in 3 volumes as History of the Things of Spain, Nueva España. For generations, the Franciscan order kept his work in manuscript form for their friars to study prior to going on mission. But eventually, they, as a public service, they published it, and it remains valuable to this day, because of course that the culture as it existed, the Aztec culture as well as the other cultures that have been subordinated by the Aztecs, the Toltecs, the Olmecs, that. Although that's all been erased, those cultures were erased. So, his history is really almost all. It's all that survives in writing. Archaeologists have found, Aztec pyramids and Mayan pyramids, but those languages haven't been translated. So anyway, the following year, 1530, the Diocese of Mexico City was created, with one of the first Franciscans as its first bishop, Bishop Juan de Zumarraga, Zumarraga, whom we will have occasion to meet again. Following year, back in Europe, 1531, Having failed to achieve theological unity at the Marburg Colloquy, the Protestant princes and lords in Germany still wanted some form of unity for military protection, because one of their objectives was political revolution, to overthrow the established sovereignty of the Holy Roman Emperors. A group of German Protestant rulers pursuing this objective formed an alliance named for the town where they met. They met in Schmalkalden in the German, I don't think it was a duchy, province. Maybe it was a county, maybe. Anyway, it was Hesse-Nassau. So Schmalkalden is Schmalkalden. It was in the region of Hesse, Hesse, and -Nassau. So there were four Hessian provinces in Germany, and this was one of them. They met. The meeting began on February 27th, 1531. And what they formed was called the Schmalkaldic League. It bound all members to wage war on any power that attacked any one of their members. And they sought foreign help. They secured the alliance of France and Denmark. All right. Now, France was Catholic, but so the Catholic France is siding with the Protestant Schmalkaldic League because the King of France, Francis I, detested Charles V. As you remember, Charles V defeated him, captured him, and extorted a huge ransom before allowing him to go free. So he places his hatred of Charles over his obligations as a Catholic sovereign. For the next 10 years, the Schmalkaldic League grew through recruiting more of the rulers of small German states who each saw the advantages of Protestant ecclesiology, that all church revenue, all church property would be in their hands, that they could confiscate any of it or all of it as they wished, and they could reduce the church that remained into nothing more than civil servants. In each case, a new German ruler joining the League was the signal for the suppression of Catholic dioceses, monasteries, and convents, sometimes with violence and murder. And, of course, confiscation or theft of the lands, the sacred vessels that had belonged there, vandalism of sacred art, smashing the windows, beheading the statues. Charles V, who as Holy Roman Emperor was charged with the defense of the faith, was too absorbed in fighting France to have the resources to stop this. Moreover, it happened slowly, over a decade, in small states that did not attract much notice. So for that decade, the rulers joined the Protestant movement and the Schmalkaldic League of their own volition. Now, Charles realized what was happening. He calculated that at that rate, within 20 years, all of Germany would be Protestant. And he knew from bitter experience at the Diet of Speyer that Protestant rulers felt free to disregard his authority as ruler of Germany. So, in 1538, Charles formed his own alliance, the Catholic League, or the League of Nuremberg, as that's where they met, with German Catholic rulers as well as other Catholic states against what was obviously a program of Protestant expansionism. So now with two rival alliances, war was inevitable. In December of 1531, the first bishop of Mexico City, whom we just met, Bishop Juan de Zumarraga, had a visit from a Nahuatl, an indigenous Mexican Indian, whom we know, Catholic tradition knows as Saint Juan Diego. He informed the bishop that the Blessed Mother had appeared to him at Tepeyac on what then was the outskirts of Mexico City, and she had instructed him to tell the bishop that she wanted a church built on that site. Now, the bishop didn't believe him and asked for proof that it was really Mary and it was not a demon trying to deceive him. So Juan went back and told this to Our Lady. Said, "Oh, look, the guy doesn't believe me." So Mary told Juan to gather up roses that were there that should not have been blooming in December, and bring them to the bishop. So Juan, he wore a tilma, which is like a poncho. We'd call it a poncho, just a slip over, thing. And it, held on both sides, front and back. So he just he put the roses in, and then held the roses to him, so they wouldn't fall, and then brought them to the bishop. So then when he got in the bishop's presence, he opened the tilma, and the roses, in place of the roses, was an image of Our Lady that is still venerated as Our Lady of Guadalupe. A basilica was constructed on the site in 1709. Pope Benedict XIV named her patroness of New Spain, which is now Mexico, in 1754, and he created a local feast in her honor on December 12th. She was designated patroness of Latin America by Pope Pius X in 1910, and patroness of all the Americas by Pope Pius XII in 1945. Her feast, December 12th, was raised to an obligatory feast in the United States by Pope, now Saint, John Paul II in 1988. And Juan Diego was canonized by the same Pope in 2002. But it started 1531. 2 years later, 1533, another version of the Protestant movement, this time Anglicanism, comes into being in England. The invalid ordination of the secretly married Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury took place on March 30th, 1533. In that capacity, as Archbishop of Canterbury, he pronounced the divorce of Henry VIII from Catherine of Aragon, and he presided over the marriage of Henry VIII with Anne Boleyn on June 1st, 1533. 10 days later, on June 11th, Pope Clement VII excommunicated Henry VIII for this invalid marriage. This was followed by the Protestant movement being imposed in England, but in a distinct form. Not Lutheranism, not Zwingliism, not Anabaptism, but Anglicanism, with the monarch as head of the church, a church that had a hierarchy, that did have bishops and priests, and that considered itself, and still does, consider itself to be in the apostolic succession. But instead of recognizing the Pope as the authority, it would just see the Pope as Bishop of Rome, but by the Act of Supremacy, which we'll discuss, but that was 1535, recognizes the king, originally the king, now the queen, as head of the church. So Queen Elizabeth II, the current monarch, is still considered head of the church in England. So the Act of Supremacy, articulating this in 1535, presented another life-changing choice. Refusal to sign it was regarded as treason against the king. Now, the vast, vast majority of secular and ecclesiastical lords of England signed it. Now, many just fled. I mean, there are some who just fled the country, but those who remain signed it after being terrorized by Henry's making an example of one senior ecclesiastic and one senior layman, executing them. The senior ecclesiastic was the Bishop of Rochester, St. John Fisher, and the prominent layman was the former Chancellor of England, St. Thomas More. So, Fisher first. He was older and he was executed first, so that's why we'll talk about him first. St. John Fisher was born in 1469 in Beverley in Yorkshire. That's in northern England. He was one of 4 children born to Robert and Agnes Fisher. After initial education at the Cathedral School, Fisher enrolled in the University of Cambridge in 1484, where he earned a Bachelor of Arts in 1487 and a Master of Arts in 1491. Ordained a priest on December 17, 1491, Father Fisher was assigned to serve as vicar of North Allerton in Yorkshire. In 1494, he resigned that position, that benefice, to become proctor of the University of Cambridge. And 3 years later, also became chaplain and confessor to the Lady Margaret Beaufort. She was the Countess of Richmond and mother of the King, Henry VII. Henry VII was the father of Henry VIII. Henry VII was king from 1485 to 1509. On July 5th, 1501, Father Fisher received a doctorate in sacred theology. 10 days later, he was elected vice-chancellor of Cambridge University. Under Fisher's guidance, his patroness, Lady Margaret, founded, which means funded, St. John's College and Christ College, both at Cambridge. And she funded a Lady Margaret Professorship of Divinity at both Oxford and Cambridge universities. Fisher was ordained Bishop of Rochester on October 14th, 1504. In the same year, he was elected Chancellor of Cambridge University. From 1505 to 1508, he also served as president of Queen's College. He promoted study of Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. In 1509, he lost his patrons. King Henry VII died on April 21st, and the Lady Margaret died 2 months later on June 29th. During the proceedings of Henry VIII against his wife, Catherine of Aragon, Bishop Fisher acted as her canonical advisor and advocate. He was imprisoned several times for speaking bluntly, publicly, against Henry's unlawful actions, and as he was a member of the House of Lords, because at that period bishops were automatically members, even though by birth he was not a lord, but as a bishop he was. As a member of Lords, he spoke against the pliant House of Commons, doing the king's bidding against the church in hopes of profiting from theft of church property. In 1529, 1531, and 1532, Bishop Fisher was arrested for various, bogus charges. Well, I shouldn't say bogus, because he actually did do it, but I'd say unjustly imprisoned for preaching in church or speaking in Parliament against actions that were contrary to the law of a Catholic monarchy, because he recognized that these policies were going to result in England no longer being a Catholic monarchy. In March of 1534, Parliament passed a Bill of Attainder against Fisher, resulting in a fourth imprisonment, until friends paid a fine of £300 to obtain his release. Okay, so this is something. The Bill of Attainder, it was part of American history in the colonial period, but is no longer. So a Bill of Attainder in English common law and in our colonial period, while we were still colonies of England, is a legislative action, a bill passed by the legislature, pronouncing a person guilty of some offense and liable to a particular penalty, which is specified in the bill. Now, this is pronouncing them guilty without due process, without a trial. So it's the legislature doing this instead of the judiciary. So, in other words, a Bill of Attainder is anyone who was imprisoned as a result of a Bill of Attainder, and everyone else understood, even if they were too afraid to say, it meant that that person was actually innocent of any real crime. But they were being imprisoned because they offended somebody powerful, or it was for a political offense. But they were not guilty of an actual crime, because if they had committed an actual crime, like stealing somebody's horse, then that would be handled in the courts. And the fine, okay, so if it stipulated that's obviously a bribe. It's extortion, but under color of law. So bribe, extortion, threats, payments, protection money. If it's done under color of law, then it's called a fine. Owing to the many abuses, obvious abuses like this, the U.S. Constitution forbade bills of attainder by name. They actually use that term. Bills of attainder are prohibited in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 3. But anyway, it was part of English common law. It was used against Fisher. But he had some friends that paid this. 300 pounds was a lot of money in that time. He was imprisoned for a fifth time on April 26, 1534, for refusing to take the oath of succession. That was another law passed by Parliament that recognized any children to be born of Henry and Anne Boleyn as legitimate heirs to the throne. So he refused to sign. Parliament then declared the Diocese of Rochester vacant, so in other words, deposed him, also uncanonical, on June 2nd, and stole his property, just nationalized his property. Well, they wouldn't have used the term nationalized, but it was confiscated his property, but it's still theft. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London along with Thomas More, whom we'll talk about next, not in the same cell, but both imprisoned in the same place. A charade was then performed in Westminster Hall on Thursday, June 17, 1534. The performers in the charade included Anne Boleyn's father, sitting among a panel of 17 to judge Fisher. The script of the charade was an arraignment of Fisher on the charge of treason. To the surprise of exactly no one, he was convicted and sentenced to death. He was executed by beheading on June 22, 1535. His head was placed on a pike to terrorize the populace, and his corpse was desecrated. Pope Leo XIII beatified John Fisher and Thomas More and 52 other English martyrs on December 29, 1886. Pope Pius XI canonized Fisher and More on May 19, 1935. They are honored in the Catholic liturgy on the same day, feast day, June 22nd, the date of Fisher's execution. St. Thomas More was the second of 6 children born to a lawyer, Sir John More, and his wife Agnes, on February 7, 1478, born in the city of London, on Milk Street. After elementary education at St. Anthony's School in London, More was accepted as a page in the household of Cardinal John Morton, Morton, who served as Archbishop of Canterbury from beginning in 1486, Chancellor of England from 1487, Cardinal 1493, and he held all of those until his death in 1500. Cardinal Morton was impressed with More's piety, his intelligence, so sponsored More to attend Oxford, where he studied classics for 2 years. And normally the Oxford course is 3 years, but More left after 2 years in obedience to his father's wishes that he study law. Now that's another day. Now we think of today that you go to law school, but in their usage, law at the time was learn more through an apprenticeship. So you went to the Inns of Court, that's different, collectors of lawyers, and More studied at Lincoln's Inn. So you essentially apprenticed to other lawyers, and you learned the ropes. And then when you reached the point, whatever the criteria was used at the time, then you were admitted to the bar. Meaning they actually did have bars in the court, so then you could stand at the bar and make an argument, in court. So More did what his father wanted. In 1502, he was admitted to the bar. He stood for election to the House of Commons in 1504. He married Jane Coke in 1505. They had 4 children before her death in 1511. In the same year, he married a widow named Alice Middleton. She had 1 daughter from her previous marriage. So he married her, and she became like a mother for the other children. They did not have children together. In 1510, More served as one of the undersheriffs of the city of London, and then as master of requests. In both capacities, he earned a reputation for honesty and efficiency. His doom was set when he accompanied Cardinal Thomas Wolsey, Archbishop of York, on a diplomatic mission to the continent, to Calais and Bruges. More did so well that he was knighted and made under-treasurer to the Exchequer. That's their version of the Treasury Department, in 1521. In this capacity, More became one of the secretaries and advisors to King Henry VIII. And that was his doom. Cardinal Wolsey failed to obtain Rome's cooperation with Henry's desire to put his wife Catherine aside in order to marry Anne Boleyn. So Henry punished Wolsey by removing him and replaced him as chancellor with More in 1529. More's time in office was brief. In 1530, More refused to sign a letter to Pope Clement VII requesting an annulment of Henry VIII's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Now, More did not dispute it. He did not dispute the king's request. He merely declined to sign it, thinking that would save him from a charge of treason. Saying that he didn't speak against it, didn't write against it. He just merely did not sign his name agreeing to it. He adopted the same strategy in 1531 with regard to the decree naming the monarch as head of the church in England. He did not publicly disagree with it or speak against it or write against it. He just did not sign it. But, you can't be chancellor. That was the senior, secular officer in the land, under the king. So you can't be the king if you're not, if you do this. So can't be the chancellor if you do this. So he resigned his position on May 16th, 1532, and he refused to attend the coronation of Anne Boleyn as Queen of England. In 1534, like Bishop John Fisher, More refused to sign the oath of succession, recognizing the issue of the marriage of Henry and Anne as legitimate heirs. So, like Fisher, More was arrested and incarcerated in the Tower of London, though not in the same cell. Another scripted farce took place on July 1st, 1535, advertised as a trial of More on the charge of treason. His judges included Anne Boleyn's father, Anne Boleyn's brother, Anne Boleyn's uncle. Thomas More continued to defend himself as having never denied the king's supremacy, never denied the legitimacy of any children with Anne. He had merely remained silent. The jury pretended to deliberate. They managed to for 15 minutes, they pretended to deliberate before announcing the verdict of guilty. Thomas More was executed by beheading on Tower Hill, July 6th, 1535. And under Fisher, I already explained when he was beatified and canonized. As in other countries, manifestation of the Protestant movement in England resulted in civil war. In English history books called The Pilgrimage of Grace, which took place the following year, 1536, triggered by Henry's theft of monasteries, convents, their property, their possessions, their sacred vessels. This pilgrimage of grace was crushed, and captured leaders were tortured to death. In 1539, 3 years later, Henry put in writing a constitution for the Church of England called the Six Articles, revealing that what Henry actually wanted was a Catholic Church with just himself as supreme head. And also, suggesting that had it not been, for the divorce, for his desire to put Catherine aside and marry Anne, he probably would never have left the Catholic Church. Because the Six Articles included belief in transubstantiation in the Eucharist and the Catholic sacraments. So it was really just a difference in authority, rejecting the authority of the Pope. And for the rest of his reign, Henry burned Lutherans and Calvinists just as quickly as he did Catholics who refused to accept him as head of the Church of England. Developments of Anglican theology would take place in future reigns. When Henry died in 1547, he had only one surviving son. This was by wife number 3, Jane Seymour. That son was only 10 years old. He reigned for only 6 years as King Edward VI. His age and poor health left practical government to his Privy Council, which by that point was filled by Calvinists, who wished no bishops, no priest, no religious garb, no sacred art in the Church of England. So they replaced Henry's 6 articles with the 42 articles in 1553. Shortly after, Edward died childless, died in the same year, 53. So the crown passed to his older half-sister, who became Queen Mary I. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and wife number 1, Catherine of Aragon. Mary, who had suffered a great deal for her faith, restored England to communion with Rome in 1555. She married a Spanish prince, Philip, who later became King Philip II of Spain. She had one pregnancy, but that child was stillborn, died still, in her womb. And then she died herself 3 years later in 1558. So that meant, so the crown then passed to the last surviving child of Henry VIII, who was a half-sister of both Edward and Mary, who became Queen Elizabeth I. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and wife number 2, Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth had a completely warped view of religion, because of the circumstances of her life, and essentially she was a survivor. She just wanted, and survival meant stability. Stopping the conflict over religion. So she wanted to find a compromise. Technically, when she became queen in 1558, England was still in union with Rome, because of the previous queen, Mary I, had restored the union. Now, Elizabeth did not like Catholicism because it regarded her as illegitimate. Yet she also did not trust Calvinists. So these are the Puritans in English as Puritans, and she did not trust them because of their anti-authoritarian tendencies and because their extremism often led to violence. So the Elizabethan settlement, as it came to be called, and which still shapes Anglicanism, was a compromise, trying to moderate between all three. So not Catholicism, which would recognize the papacy, but yet not Calvinism, not Lutheranism, not Zwingliism, but a compromise in between. So this Elizabethan settlement consisted of reissuing the Act of Supremacy, declaring the sovereign to be the head of the Church of England. Second, the Act of Uniformity, which stipulated the structure of the Church of England, which means that it would have a hierarchy, it would have bishops and priests. Those bishops claimed to have apostolic succession, and they would wear clerical garb. They would have some, use of some sacred art, certainly sacred music. And third, the Anglican Mass, or the service, the Anglican version of the Mass, was based on the Book of Common Prayer, which did not explicitly exclude, nor did it explicitly affirm the Catholic understanding of the real presence. So the thinking was that, so a Catholic could attend the Anglican Mass and was not required to deny the real presence, if they wanted to believe that's what was happening. But yet a Calvinist, or someone who rejected it, was also not required to believe in the real presence. So that was Elizabeth's thinking. This settlement was summarized in the 39 Articles in 1563. Elizabeth herself had essentially no religious conviction, having grown up in an environment in which religion was used politically and often to justify homicide, including the beheading of her own mother. Article 6 of the 39 Articles affirms that Scripture contains all things necessary to salvation, without mentioning church councils. So it doesn't declare that church councils must be rejected. It just doesn't mention them. Yet Article 8 states that creeds produced by councils are accepted to the extent that they can be proven by Scripture. Article 17 is a masterpiece of ambiguity in acknowledging existence of belief in predestination, which was a Calvinist thing, without specifying if the Church of England accepted it, rejected it, or adopted the Catholic view, the Calvinist view, the Lutheran view, or some other view. It was just silent on that. Article 28 was written in such general terms that a Catholic could read it as permitting belief in the real presence, while at the same time a Calvinist could interpret it as permitting belief in receptionism, which is their view that at the Lord's Supper, that it's a commemoration, but that the faithful partake of Christ in the act of sharing and receiving the bread and wine. England was removed for the last time. Not the last time, but it was removed from communion with Rome once more in 1570 when Pope Pius V excommunicated Elizabeth. And I will discuss that later. And he absolved her subjects of their oaths of loyalty to her. He did this in the belief that Spain was going to invade England and install a completely Catholic monarchy, because the Spanish prince that Queen Mary I had married, Philip, by that point he had become king, Philip II of Spain. So that's the background for the Spanish Armada, which we'll cover in due course. That attempt failed, as all the world knows, and Elizabeth spent the rest of her reign pursuing and executing Catholic priests as traitors. Okay, so rewinding. 1533, while all that's going on in England, another version of Protestantism, the Protestant movement, comes into being, Calvinism. So we meet another one of these guys. John Calvin lived from 1509 to 1564. He was born a younger son of a middle-class family in Picardy, France, 60 miles northeast of Paris. As a younger son, he was destined for the church, receiving tonsure and a benefice at age 12, the feudalism problem. The income of the benefice was used to fund his education. He received an excellent education from the church, mastering Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He then moved to Paris to study theology from 1523 to 1528. There, like Luther, he developed a deep aversion for scholasticism, which at the time was taught by rote memorization. As often happens, Calvin projected his dislike of his studies onto those in authority and those who used the method he hated to support their own authority. In other words, the church. This intellectual dislike of the institutional church was soon magnified by bitter personal experience. See, that's another continuing thread. Every one of these guys, they had some personal thing. They had some personal axe to grind against the church. In his case, in 1528, Calvin's father became embroiled in a financial dispute that became a legal dispute with a local cathedral chapter. It was so scarring for the family that Calvin's father transferred John Calvin himself from preparing for ecclesiastical life in Paris to send him to a completely different university at Orléans to study law. The move proved to be life-changing because it brought Calvin into contact with a group of humanist and crypto-Protestants. I say crypto-hidden Protestants because France was still officially a Catholic country. Like John Calvin, they loved the study of ancient languages. That was originally their point of commonality. And like young students in college, feeling rebellious, they blended their late-night discussions, to fix the world, with ridicule of the church, with insistence that things have to change. We've got to do something. His anti-clericalism hardened into hatred for the church when his father sued the cathedral chapter to recover a debt owed to him, and the cathedral chapter retaliated by excommunicating him. His father died shortly after, still excommunicate, and therefore was denied a Catholic funeral until Calvin's older brother paid off the cathedral chapter in what John Calvin regarded as a bribe to the senior cathedral canons. Never forgot that. As a result of this, by 1533, Calvin embraced the movement of protest, the Protestant movement, and was at least honest enough to resign his benefice when he decided to leave the church. The following year, he was forced to flee France after some aggressive students in his network brought the local protest movement to the attention of local authorities. This is the affair of the placards, for those of you interested in French history. Placards are essentially posters, so they just made posters with slogans, Protestant slogans. They were taping them, not taping, but, hanging them up all over. This was a protest. But that brought him, to the attention of local authorities. And since France was a Catholic monarchy, the heretics got burned if captured, so he left. He first went to Metz, then he followed the Rhine River down until he made it to Switzerland and settled first in Basel, Basle, on Lake Constance. There he began work on what became his magnum opus titled The Institutes. Interestingly, originally written in Latin, but probably because he was in Switzerland, which is a multilingual country. It still is. He arrived in Switzerland only 2 years after the Proto-Swiss Protestant, Ulrich Zwingli, died in battle in October 1531. John Calvin's serious demeanor, his austere manner of life, and his undeniable intellectual ability brought him to the attention of Swiss Protestants, who were looking for a guide since Zwingli's death. In July of 1536, the City Council of Geneva invited Calvin to be their preacher and teacher of theology. Calvinism, as a distinct manifestation of the protest movement, can be dated to this period. His interpretation of the movement was far more extreme than Luther. First, Calvin did not adopt Luther's nationalist ecclesiology, which he could hardly do in Switzerland since he was French. He was not Swiss. Instead, he promoted a congregational model of governments, with all believers allegedly equal, the priesthood of all believers, so the priesthood of all the baptized. Second, he did, however, adopt Luther's sola scriptura, sola fide, scripture alone, faith alone, and he rejected the saving efficacy of good works, as did Luther. Luther thought our good works are just dirty rags that have to be covered over by the merits of Christ. That's his phrase. Calvin was even more extreme than Luther in this regard. Calvin believed in the total depravity of human nature after the fall, after original sin. And he held that human beings do not have free will, but left on their own follow concupiscence. For this reason, even works which appear to be good are in fact not, because they're performed by a depraved human nature. But they are not counted as sins owing to the imputed merits of Christ. Third, Calvin went farther than Luther in arguing for a soteriology of absolute predestination. So the soter means to save. So soteriology is theology of salvation, meaning how do we get to heaven? Calvin's soteriology was predestination, that God not only knows who's going to go to heaven or hell, but before creation predestined some to salvation and predestined others to damnation. And there's nothing you can do to change that. Fourth, this should be needless to explain, but just for the sake of completeness, naturally, of course, Calvin presumptively rejected the divine institution of the priesthood, the Petrine authority of the Pope, the real presence in the Eucharist. 2 years later, in 1538, Calvin was forced to flee Switzerland after coming into conflict with the authorities of the more powerful city of Bern, Berne. For the next 3 years, he based himself in Strasbourg, continuing to develop his doctrines and making contacts through correspondence all across Europe. In 1541, Calvin's supporters in Geneva gained control of the city council and invited him to return. He spent the rest of his life in Geneva. Though initially favoring an ecclesiology of congregationalism, in Geneva he instead imposed an ecclesiology of theocracy, where the church was the government, with the church controlling the state in a far more extreme manner than any of the Catholic Inquisitions. The male population was divided into 4 classes. The adult male: pastors, doctors, elders, deacons, and the rest were just too young to be assigned. He created a consistory, which is a term from Catholic usage, but of course he meant to use it differently. The consistory for him amounted to a moral tribunal, empowered to inflict punishment on the unrighteous for moral offenses. This included public shaming. You could be put in the stocks, public torture, flogging, mutilation. You could have an ear cut off, a tongue cut out, or, an eye put out, a hand cut off, or execution. That was also possible, depending on the offense. Pleasures of the flesh were outlawed, such as dancing, theaters, taverns, games, laughing, and gambling were all prohibited. And while this was going on, he continued publishing biblical commentaries, and he published many of them. Geneva served as a sanctuary for radicals of the protest movement from across Europe. In this way, the Calvinist version of the protest movement spread, shaping the French Huguenots, the Scottish Presbyterians, the Dutch Reformed Church, and the English Puritans. And through the English Puritans, various congregational forms in what became the United States, such as Presbyterianism. That's American Calvinism. Okay, while that's going on in Calvin's life, in 1533, Spain conquered Peru in South America. Archaeologists have identified several distinct cultures living in South America by the year 100 AD on our calendars. Over the centuries after they combined, one asserted dominance, then fell, replaced by another, and on and on, just as happened in European history. In the 13th century, one of the mountain tribes asserted hegemony to the point that it can be called the first known empire in the history of South America. Under the leadership of their first emperor, Manco Capac, they built the city of Cusco as their capital in 1233. Now, this tribe, these people, call themselves the Quechua, but Europeans came to know them better by the title of their ruler, the Inca, who was believed to personify the sun god. Like the Aztecs in Mexico, the Inca in Peru went through a period of expansionism, conquering the Aymara and the Chimu by 1470 and the Quito by 1513. Conquest by the Inca included imposing their religion on the conquered tribes, meaning worship of the Inca. The religion of the Quechua, of the Inca, included hematomancy, blood magic, which included human sacrifice, but not as routinely or on the scale as the Aztecs. The Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, had taken part in the conquest of what is now Panama. Panama was the name of a tribe in the area, but now, of course, it's the country. But he was frustrated that he had not satisfied his one consuming passion in life, which was gold. In 1531, he gathered a band of like-minded veterans to pursue rumors of what he heard was a wealthy empire in a place or among a people called the Biru, at least as he heard it, at least as his Spanish ear heard it. Now, he had no idea where to go other than south from Panama. He wandered through what is now Ecuador and the Peruvian coast for a year and a half and didn't see anybody, not realizing that the civilization was actually above him, like 2 miles up in the air in the Andes Mountains. At this point, nearing panic, as he couldn't believe a land that vast just didn't have anybody living in it. And then something happened. It was just a happenstance that changed history. He fell upon or saw a group of raft travelers who had pulled up to the coast to hunt. He captured them and tortured them to gain information. And that's where he learned that the wealth he sought was 2 miles up in the air. So he and his men climbed until they climbed the Andes Mountains until they reached Cajamarca, Cajamarca, on November 15th, 1532. They captured the unsuspecting Inca, who was named Atahualpa, Atahualpa, and murdered 7,000 inhabitants of the city. In an infamous deception, Pizarro promised the Inca Atahualpa that his life would be spared if he ordered his people to fill a room in the palace. He told the Inca to stand up and raise his hands. And at that level, he said, if your people can fill this room with gold up to that level, then I'll spare your life. So the Inca sent messages out, and they did it. They brought that much gold. They'd imagine how much gold that would... and at that point, Pizarro murdered the Inca on July 26, 1533. Pope Clement VII died the following year on September 25, 1534, after what must qualify as one of the most painful 11 years in the history of the papacy. He was followed as Pope 220 by Pope Paul III, who would summon the Council of Trent. But we will do him in a separate file, a separate video. So for now, we'll end with Clement VII. Thank you for your attention. This session is adjourned.